They say the forest keeps its secrets, but every now and then, it whispers to those who know how to listen. My name's Jacob Carter. I've walked these trails as a ranger for years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found that autumn morning. A dog tied to a tree, his eyes full of pain and loyalty. At first, I thought it was just another case of abandonment. But as I looked closer, I realized this was no ordinary dog. And the story he carried, well, it changed everything. This is the story of Max, a military dog, and the man who left him behind. And maybe, just maybe, the story of how we all found our way back to each other. The forest of Forest Ridge was Jacob Carter's sanctuary. After years serving in the military, this sprawling wilderness had become his refuge, a place to find solace amidst the towering oaks, rustling leaves, and crisp autumn air. His job as a ranger gave him purpose, though on most mornings the work was uneventful, inspecting trails, checking for poachers, or helping the occasional lost hiker. But this morning was different. Jacob's boots crunched softly on the dew-covered ground as golden rays of sunlight pierced through the dense canopy of trees. The air was sharp, filled with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, signaling the season's transition. He adjusted the strap of his ranger's backpack and scanned the area with a practiced eye, his hand instinctively brushing the hunting knife at his belt, a habit he'd never shaken from his time in the service. As he approached a clearing, a faint, almost imperceptible sound stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't the usual rustling of squirrels or the chatter of birds. It was a whimper, soft, fragile, and it tugged at something deep inside him. Jacob froze, his breath held as he strained to listen. The sound came again, this time more distinct. His sharp instincts kicked in, honed by years in combat zones. Slowly he followed the noise, his boots now moving with deliberate silence. The whimper grew louder as he neared the base of a weathered oak tree, its roots twisted like ancient veins gripping the earth. And there he saw it. A dog. The animal was tied to the tree with a length of frayed rope, its body hunched and trembling. Its coat, once likely thick and glossy, was matted with dirt, and its ribs protruded sharply beneath its skin. The dog's eyes, however, were what hit Jacob the hardest. They were filled with pain, yes, but also a flicker of hope, as though it still believed someone would come back for it. "Hey, buddy," Jacob said softly, crouching a few feet away. His voice, though calm, cracked under the weight of the moment. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog flinched at first, its ears flattening against its head. It whimpered again but didn't growl or bark. Instead, it seemed to be assessing him, its brown eyes locked onto his every movement. Jacob reached into his pack, pulling out a water bottle and an old granola bar he'd stuffed there earlier. "You must be starving," he murmured, tearing off a small piece of the bar and holding it out in his palm. The dog hesitated, sniffing the air, before cautiously inching forward to take the food. As the dog ate, Jacob's eyes fell on the metal tag hanging from its collar. The glint of sunlight caught the engraved lettering, and his heart stopped. He leaned closer, wiping away the grime with his thumb. Ethan Reed! The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Memories surged forward. The sweltering heat of desert deployments, the tension of night patrols, and the bond of camaraderie forged in the crucible of war. Ethan had been more than a comrade. He'd been a friend, the kind you trusted with your life. And now, his name was here, on a dog abandoned in the middle of nowhere. "Max," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible. He remembered Ethan's dog, a military working dog trained to detect explosives and save lives. Could this really be him? The dog tilted its head at the sound of the name, a faint wag of its tail stirring the fallen leaves around it. Jacob's chest tightened. It was Max. "What the hell happened to you?" Jacob muttered, his mind racing. The rope tying Max to the tree was frayed but secure, knotted in a way that Jacob recognized. It wasn't the work of an amateur. This was deliberate. Someone had left Max here, tied and vulnerable, in a place where survival was a slim chance, and that someone had military training. Jacob's thoughts immediately turned to Ethan. He hadn't spoken to him in years, not since they'd both left the service. Ethan had struggled with the transition, battling demons Jacob couldn't even imagine. Could he have done this? The Ethan Jacob knew would never willingly abandon Max, his trusted partner, his lifeline during some of their darkest missions. The thought unsettled him. Jacob inspected the area around the tree, his eyes scanning the ground with the precision of a tracker. The soft earth revealed faint boot prints, large, likely a man's, and scattered cigarette butts. The brand was familiar, one Ethan had smoked during their service days. He was here, Jacob murmured, more to himself than to Max. But why? Max, as if sensing Jacob's turmoil, nudged his hand gently with a wet nose. It was a small gesture, but it steadied Jacob. "All right, buddy," he said, standing up and pulling out a small pocket knife. "Let's get you out of here." The rope fell away with a few quick cuts, and Max immediately stretched, his body stiff from being confined. Jacob patted the dog gently, noting the scars along his side and the raw patches where the rope had rubbed his skin. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Jacob said, his voice tinged with sadness. Max leaned into him, a gesture of trust that only deepened Jacob's resolve. Jacob took out his phone, snapping a few photos of the area, the prints, the cigarette butts, the rope, evidence in case he needed it. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. "We're going to figure this out," he promised Max, scratching the dog gently behind the ears. He led Max back to his truck, parked at the edge of the forest. The dog hesitated before climbing into the back seat, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if still on duty. Jacob spread an old blanket across the seat to make him comfortable. "You've still got that soldier's heart, don't you?" Jacob said with a faint smile. As he started the engine, Jacob's mind churned with questions. Where was Ethan? What had happened to him? And why would he leave Max like this? The road ahead felt uncertain, but Jacob knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave Max's side until he got answers. The drive back to Jacob's cabin was quiet, save for the low hum of the truck's engine. Max lay curled in the back seat, his head resting on Jacob's old work jacket, his weary eyes still scanning the surroundings through the window. Every now and then, Jacob glanced in the rearview mirror, his mind teeming with questions he couldn't answer. When they arrived, Jacob parked near the small log cabin nestled on the edge of the forest. It was modest but comfortable, with stacks of split firewood lining the porch and the faint smell of pine lingering in the crisp air. Max hesitated before jumping out of the truck, his legs stiff from exhaustion. "Come on, boy," Jacob said gently, leading him inside. The cabin's interior was warm and inviting, with a stone fireplace crackling in the corner. Jacob filled a bowl with water and set it down for Max, who drank deeply before collapsing onto a worn rug near the hearth. Jacob watched him for a moment, the faint glow of the fire reflecting off Max's tired yet alert eyes. "Max," Jacob murmured, leaning against the counter, "you've been through more than I can imagine, haven't you?" He sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. The name Ethan Reed still echoed in his mind, dredging up memories he hadn't revisited in years. It was during their last deployment in the sweltering heat of the desert that Jacob had first met Max. Ethan had always called him the best partner I've ever had, and he wasn't wrong. Max was more than just a bomb-sniffing dog. He was a soldier, as much a part of their team as any man. Jacob remembered the night that had changed everything. They'd been walking a narrow dirt path under the cover of darkness, their unit's nerves taut as bowstrings. Max had stopped suddenly. His ears pricked, a low growl vibrating in his throat. "Hold up!" Ethan had whispered, crouching beside him. The dog's behavior had saved their lives that night, alerting them to an ambush just ahead. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. Now, Jacob stared at Max, the once proud dog reduced to skin and bones, and wondered what had happened to Ethan. The next morning, Jacob decided to return to the clearing where he'd found Max. There had to be something he missed, a clue, a trail, anything to explain why Ethan had left Max tied to that tree. The air was colder, the sky overcast. As Jacob retraced his steps, Max padded silently beside him, his ears flicking at every sound in the forest. Jacob couldn't help but admire the dog's resilience. Even after everything, he moved with a quiet dignity. When they reached the clearing, Jacob's sharp eyes scanned the ground. The boot prints he'd noticed the day before were still visible, though faint after a night of frost. He crouched to inspect them, noting the distinct tread pattern. "Military issue," he muttered. "These are Ethan's, no doubt about it." Nearby, he found the scattered cigarette butts he'd seen before. Picking one up, he rolled it between his fingers. The brand was familiar, Ethan's preferred choice during their service. "Why here, Ethan?" Jacob whispered, more to himself than to Max. He continued searching the area, this time expanding his perimeter. Max stayed close, his nose occasionally dipping to the ground, as if he too was searching for answers. A few yards away, something caught Jacob's eye. Beneath a cluster of fallen leaves lay a small, metallic object. He bent down to retrieve it, his breath catching as he realized what it was. A dog tag. Not Max's, but Ethan's. Jacob's pulse quickened as he examined the tag, his thumb tracing the engraved name. The fact that Ethan's dog tag was here, and not with him, raised even more questions. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Jacob muttered, slipping the tag into his pocket. Max let out a soft whine, drawing Jacob's attention. The dog stood by a patch of disturbed earth, his body tense. Jacob moved closer and saw faint indentations in the ground, as though someone had knelt there recently. His mind raced. The evidence was clear. Ethan had been here, but something had gone wrong. Jacob spent the next hour documenting everything. He took photos of the boot prints, the cigarette butts, and the area where Ethan had likely knelt. He also marked the location on his map, noting its proximity to a small creek and an old hunting trail they'd used during their youth. As he worked, memories of Ethan's struggles surfaced. The last time Jacob had spoken to him, Ethan had mentioned feeling overwhelmed, haunted by the things they'd seen and done. He'd talked about moving to a remote cabin to clear his head, but Jacob hadn't heard from him since. The guilt settled heavy in Jacob's chest. He should have checked in. Should have done more. Back at the cabin that evening, Jacob spread his findings across the table. He laid out the photos, the dog tag, and a hand-drawn map of the area. Max lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, watching Jacob with quiet intensity. Jacob stared at the evidence, his mind piecing together a fragmented puzzle. The boot prints, the cigarettes, the dog tag, everything pointed to Ethan being in the area. But why abandon Max? Why leave behind these signs of his presence? As the fire crackled in the background, Jacob made a decision. He couldn't leave this alone. Ethan was out there somewhere, and he wasn't going to stop until he found him. Leaning back in his chair, Jacob looked over at Max. The dog's eyes met his, and in that moment, it felt as though they shared the same determination. "Don't worry, Max," Jacob said softly. "We'll find him. Together." Chapter 3. The Clue and the Hidden Letter. The sound of Max's steady breathing filled the cab of Jacob's truck as they made their way to Dr. Laura Mitchell's veterinary clinic. The small building sat at the edge of the town, its red and white exterior framed by tall oak trees. Jacob had known Laura for years. She'd helped with injured wildlife, and had always been a calm, reassuring presence in the community. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Max lifted his head, his ears perking up slightly. Despite his exhaustion, the dog's instincts were sharp, his eyes scanning their surroundings. Jacob reached back and scratched behind Max's ears. "You'll be okay, buddy," he murmured. "Dr. Mitchell's one of the good ones." Inside the clinic, Laura greeted them with her usual warm smile. She was in her late 30s, with auburn hair tied into a loose ponytail and hazel eyes that seemed to notice everything. Dressed in a light blue coat over a sweater, she exuded a calm confidence that immediately put both humans and animals at ease. "Jacob Carter," she said with a raised brow, "it's not often I see you bringing in a dog. What's the story here?" Jacob gave her a quick rundown, skipping the more personal details. "Found him tied to a tree in Forest Ridge. He's in rough shape. Can you take a look?" Laura crouched down to Max's level, speaking softly as she extended her hand. "Hey there, big guy. Let's see how you're doing." Max, though cautious, didn't pull away. He let Laura run her hands gently over his body, checking for injuries or signs of distress. She frowned as her fingers moved over his ribs. "He's severely undernourished," she said, glancing up at Jacob. "But his muscle tone suggests he was in excellent condition not too long ago. Whoever left him like that, it wasn't random." Jacob nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, I figured as much." As Laura continued her examination, her fingers brushed against Max's collar. She paused, tilting her head in curiosity. "There's something tucked in here," she said, carefully loosening the collar. Jacob leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Laura slid out a folded piece of paper, crumpled and stained with dirt. She handed it to Jacob, who unfolded it with shaking hands. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, as if written in a moment of desperation. "I thought I could protect him, but I was wrong. He's better off without me. I'm sorry." Jacob's chest tightened as he read the words. His mind immediately went to Ethan. The handwriting wasn't familiar. Ethan had always been neat and precise, but the tone was unmistakably his. Laura watched Jacob's face, her expression softening. "You know who wrote it?" Jacob nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's from Ethan Reed, an old friend." She frowned. "The same Ethan whose name is on Max's tag?" "Yeah," Jacob said, his voice quieter now. "We served together. Max was his partner." Laura stood and crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "Jacob, this isn't just about a dog, is it? Your friend. He's in trouble, isn't he?" Jacob exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Ethan's been struggling since we left the service. I haven't heard from him in years, and now, this. He wouldn't just abandon Max, not unless he thought he had no other choice." Laura nodded, her tone firm but gentle. "Well, Max is dehydrated and malnourished, but he's tough. With some care, he'll recover. But Jacob, if Ethan's in the kind of place where he thinks leaving Max is the answer, you need to find him." "I know," Jacob said, his voice filled with determination. "I can't let him go through this alone." Laura moved to a cabinet, pulling out supplies to set Max up with fluids and a temporary diet plan. As she worked, Jacob couldn't help but replay the words of the note in his head. Ethan's guilt was palpable, but it also hinted at something deeper, a fear that staying with Max would only bring harm. Jacob's gut told him Ethan wasn't just running from his demons. He was trying to protect Max from something. After finishing with Max's care, Laura handed Jacob a list of instructions. "Make sure he gets plenty of rest and small meals to start. He's got some old scars, but nothing life-threatening. And Jacob," she added, her tone softening, "be careful. If Ethan's in this deep, he might not be thinking clearly." "I'll find him," Jacob said with quiet resolve, "and I'll bring him back." As he led Max back to the truck, Jacob felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. Max followed closely, his trust in Jacob growing with every step. Once inside, Jacob sat for a moment, staring at the note. The words seemed to blur as a flood of emotions washed over him. Anger at Ethan for abandoning Max, sorrow for whatever pain had driven him to this point, and guilt for not being there sooner. The drive back to the cabin was silent, but Jacob's mind was anything but. He thought about Ethan's struggles after leaving the military, the way he'd withdrawn, the cryptic conversations they'd had before losing touch. Jacob had known Ethan wasn't okay, but he'd convinced himself that time and space would help. Now, it was clear that wasn't enough. When they arrived home, Jacob pulled out the evidence he'd gathered, the dog tag, the photos from the clearing, and now, the note. He spread them out on the table, the pieces of a puzzle that felt impossible to solve. Max lay by the fireplace, watching Jacob with those intelligent eyes. It was as if the dog understood the weight of the moment, his presence a silent reassurance. Jacob leaned back in his chair, the note clutched in his hand. "We'll find him, Max," he said aloud, his voice steady. "Whatever it takes, we'll bring him back." The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor, a quiet but resolute response. The road to Evergreen Pines twisted and turned like the memories Jacob had tried to leave behind. The truck's tires crunched over gravel as towering evergreens loomed on either side, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon light. Beside him, Max sat upright, his head tilted as if listening to the forest. Jacob's thoughts churned as he drove deeper into the wilderness, each passing mile pulling him closer to Ethan, and the answers he so desperately needed. It wasn't just concern for Ethan that tightened his chest. It was guilt. Ethan had been one of the strongest men Jacob knew back in their military days, but strength on the battlefield didn't always translate to peace at home. Jacob should have seen it coming, should have done more. The truck jolted over a bump, pulling him from his thoughts. Evergreen Pines opened up before him, a dense, untamed expanse of wilderness, far removed from the small towns and familiar paths of his ranger territory. He parked at the edge of the clearing, where Ethan's cabin sat hunched beneath the weight of the forest canopy. The cabin was smaller than Jacob had imagined, its walls weathered and streaked with moss. A pile of split firewood leaned precariously against the side, untouched. There were no signs of life, no smoke from the chimney, no footprints in the dirt. "Stay close, Max," Jacob said as he stepped out of the truck. The dog leapt down and followed him, his ears swiveling with every faint rustle of the trees. Jacob climbed the steps to the porch and knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the quiet clearing. "Ethan," he called out. "It's Jacob. Are you in there?" Nothing. Jacob hesitated, then tried the handle. The door swung open with a low creak, revealing the dim interior. The sight that greeted him was both chaotic and haunting. Maps covered the walls, pinned in no particular order. Many were marked with red circles and arrows pointing to deep, secluded areas of the forest. On the table lay a mess of papers, notes scrawled in jagged handwriting. Jacob picked up one, his heart sinking as he read. "Shadows everywhere. Can't sleep. Must protect him." A low whine drew Jacob's attention to the corner of the room. Max stood by a small pile of belongings. His old leash, a rubber ball so worn it looked on the verge of splitting, and a blanket that carried the faint scent of the dog. Jacob crouched beside Max, picking up the ball. His thumb ran over its cracked surface as a memory surfaced. It had been a scorching afternoon in the desert, the kind of heat that felt like it was searing through their gear. Ethan had been tossing the ball for Max during a rare moment of downtime. The dog's boundless energy had lifted the mood of the entire unit, even as exhaustion pressed heavily on them. "You know, this dog's got more discipline than most of the guys I trained with," Ethan had joked, his grin breaking through the grime on his face. Jacob had laughed. "That's because Max listens to you, not the sergeant." Ethan had turned serious for a moment, crouching to scratch behind Max's ears. "This dog saved my life more times than I can count. I'd give anything to keep him safe." The memory lingered like a bitter aftertaste. Jacob stared at the ball in his hand, now just a relic of better days. He turned his attention to the maps. One in particular caught his eye, a detailed chart of evergreen pines with a single location circled in red, Firewatch Tower. Jacob felt a jolt of recognition. Ethan had spoken about the tower once during one of their long nights in the desert. "It's the one place I could clear my head," Ethan had said, staring at the horizon. No noise, no chaos, just trees, sky, and silence. The circle on the map felt like a beacon, drawing Jacob toward it. He folded the map and slipped it into his pocket, then turned to Max. "We've got our next lead, boy," Jacob said, his voice steady. "We're going to find him." As Jacob stepped back out into the clearing, the air felt colder, the forest more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around him as he made his way back to the truck, his mind replaying fragments of memories from their time together. One mission in particular lingered. They'd been deep in enemy territory, the heat of the desert mingling with the tension of impending danger. Ethan had been the one to spot the tripwire, his sharp eyes and steady hand saving them from walking straight into an ambush. Max had been by his side, barking a warning that had echoed through the narrow canyon. "Clear the area!" Ethan had barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Jacob had followed without hesitation, trusting Ethan's instincts as they navigated the threat. Now, years later, that same man had left behind the dog who had been his shadow. Jacob couldn't reconcile the image of Ethan as a leader with the man he'd become. Back at the truck, Jacob opened the door, and Max jumped in with the grace of a soldier still on duty. Jacob glanced at the map again, the red circle standing out against the intricate lines of the forest. "Hold on, Ethan," Jacob murmured as he started the engine. "We're coming for you." As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that finding Ethan at the Firewatch Tower would only be the beginning. The red circle on the map wasn't just a destination. It was the start of a path neither he nor Max could turn away from. The forest grew darker with each passing moment, the fading sunlight painting the horizon in shades of amber and crimson. Jacob adjusted the flashlight on his belt as he and Max made their way along the narrow trail. The Firewatch Tower loomed in the distance, a skeletal silhouette against the twilight sky. Max led the way, his steps purposeful but cautious, his ears twitching at every rustle in the undergrowth. Jacob felt a strange sense of unease, not from the forest itself, but from the unknown that awaited them. The air was colder here, the trees towering higher and denser, as if shielding the tower from the outside world. "We're close," Jacob murmured to Max, his voice barely audible over the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. The trail opened up to a small clearing where the tower stood. Its wooden beams creaked faintly in the evening breeze, and the metal stairs glinted dully in the fading light. Jacob scanned the area, his sharp eyes picking up faint disturbances in the ground, footprints leading toward the base of the tower. "He's here," Jacob said softly, his grip tightening on Max's leash. Jacob approached the tower cautiously, his boots silent on the soft ground. Max's ears perked up, his body tense but steady. Jacob tilted his head upward, his eyes following the length of the tower to the platform at the top. There, faintly illuminated by the last rays of daylight, was a figure hunched against the railing. "Ethan!" Jacob called out, his voice firm but calm. The figure didn't respond. For a moment, Jacob thought he might be too late. Then, the figure stirred, turning slightly toward him. "Who's there?" the voice rasped, low and cracked. "It's Jacob," he called back. "I'm here with Max." There was a long pause. Then, the voice came again, weaker this time. No, you're not real. You're not real." Jacob exhaled sharply, his chest tightening. He motioned for Max to stay and began ascending the creaking metal stairs, each step echoing in the heavy silence. When Jacob reached the platform, the sight before him made his breath catch. Ethan was sitting on the floor, his back against the railing, his head bowed low. His hair was unkempt, streaked with gray, and his face was gaunt, marked by deep shadows under his eyes. He clutched a piece of paper in one trembling hand, his other hand gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "Ethan," Jacob said softly, crouching a few feet away. "It's me. It's Jacob." Ethan's eyes flicked toward him, hollow and filled with disbelief. "You're not real," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You can't be. You're just another one of them." Jacob frowned, his heart breaking at the sight of his once steady friend reduced to this. "I'm real, Ethan. And so is Max. He's downstairs, waiting for you." At the mention of Max, something flickered in Ethan's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or hope. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by doubt. "No," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. "I left him. I had to. He's safer without me." Jacob edged closer, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "He's not safer without you, Ethan. He needs you, and you need him." Ethan's grip on the railing tightened, his knuckles turning white. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. I can't trust myself anymore. I see things, shadows, whispers. I don't know what's real." Jacob let the silence hang between them for a moment before speaking. "I know it's hard, Ethan. I've been there. The nights when you can't sleep, the days when you can't breathe, but you don't have to go through it alone." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, and he looked away, his shoulders shaking. "I tried, Jacob. I tried to make it better, to keep him safe, but I can't even do that." Jacob moved closer until he was sitting next to Ethan, their backs against the railing. "You didn't fail, Ethan. Max is alive because of you, and now he's here to help you, just like he always has." For the first time, Ethan seemed to really see Jacob. His gaze softened, and the faintest hint of clarity appeared in his expression. He's okay?" Jacob nodded. "He's more than okay. He's been waiting for you." As if on cue, Max let out a low bark from below. Ethan flinched, then froze, his eyes widening. Slowly he pushed himself to his feet, gripping the railing for support. He looked down toward the base of the tower, where Max stood, his tail wagging faintly as he stared up at his handler. Ethan let out a choked sound, a mix of disbelief and emotion. "Max!" he whispered. "Go to him," Jacob said, standing and placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "He's been waiting for you this whole time." Ethan hesitated, his body trembling as he descended the stairs. Jacob followed a few steps behind, ready to steady him if needed. When they reached the bottom, Max trotted forward, his tail wagging more vigorously now. Ethan dropped to his knees, his hands reaching out shakily. "Max," Ethan whispered again, tears streaming down his face as the dog pressed into him, licking his hands and face. "I'm so sorry, boy. I'm so sorry." Max leaned into Ethan, his tail thumping against the ground, as if forgiving him in an instant. Jacob stood back, watching the reunion with a lump in his throat. It was a small moment, but it was a start. A flicker of hope in the darkness that had consumed Ethan for so long. After a few minutes, Ethan looked up at Jacob, his eyes red but clearer than before. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted, his voice raw. But I don't want to be alone anymore. Jacob nodded, his expression steady. You don't have to be. We'll figure it out together. Ethan's gaze shifted back to Max, who remained by his side, his loyalty unshaken. Thank you, Ethan said quietly, his voice cracking. Jacob extended a hand, helping Ethan to his feet. Let's get out of here. We've got a long road ahead, but you're not walking it alone. The ride back from the Firewatch Tower was silent, but not uncomfortable. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting in his lap, occasionally glancing at Max, who lay curled in the back seat. The dog's presence seemed to anchor him, his gaze softening each time their eyes met. Jacob kept his focus on the road, knowing this was just the first step in a long journey. The headlights cut through the early morning fog as they neared Jacob's cabin. When they arrived, Jacob parked the truck and turned to Ethan. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow, we're going to Maple Haven. Ethan frowned, his expression guarded. What's Maple Haven? A support center for veterans, Jacob replied. They've got people who understand what you're going through. Therapists, doctors, and a program for guys like you and Max. Animal-assisted therapy. Ethan tensed. I don't need therapy. Jacob met his eyes steadily. You do, Ethan, and it's not a weakness to ask for help. You've already taken the hardest step, letting me and Max back in. Let's finish the job. For a moment, Ethan said nothing, his gaze dropping to his hands. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely audible. Okay. The next morning, after a quiet breakfast, Jacob loaded Max into the truck and helped Ethan climb into the passenger seat. The drive to Maple Haven took a little over an hour, the forest giving way to rolling fields as they approached the outskirts of town. Maple Haven was a modest but welcoming facility, its rustic wooden exterior framed by maple trees whose leaves blazed in fiery shades of orange and red. A large sign out front read, Maple Haven Veterans Support Center, Healing Together. Jacob parked and turned to Ethan. This is it. Ready? Ethan hesitated, then gave a small nod. Max seemed to sense the importance of the moment, sitting upright and alert as if ready to guide Ethan forward. Inside, the center exuded warmth and calm. A receptionist greeted them with a kind smile, her tone gentle as she explained the intake process. A few other veterans sat in the waiting area, some with service dogs by their sides. Ethan's posture was stiff as they were led to an office where a counselor, Dr. Rachel Peterson, waited. She was in her early 40s, with a calm demeanor and an understanding smile. Ethan, she said, extending her hand. I'm Rachel. It's nice to meet you. Ethan shook her hand reluctantly. Jacob said you work with veterans. We do, Rachel said, gesturing for them to sit. And we also have programs for service animals. Max is welcome here too. Ethan's gaze flicked to Max, who sat quietly by his side. What exactly do you do here? Rachel leaned forward slightly, her tone empathetic. We focus on helping veterans heal from the invisible wounds of war. PTSD, anxiety, depression. We use a combination of counseling, group therapy, and animal-assisted therapy. A lot of our staff are veterans too. They've been where you are. Ethan's shoulders sagged slightly, as though the weight he carried was finally beginning to ease. The first few days were difficult. Ethan struggled with group therapy sessions, his instinct to withdraw clashing with the encouragement of the counselors. But Max was a constant presence, his loyalty and gentle demeanor grounding Ethan during the toughest moments. One afternoon during a session, another veteran shared a story about his struggles with PTSD and how his service dog had saved his life. Ethan listened intently, his hand resting on Max's head. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated before finally opening up. I thought I could handle it alone, Ethan admitted, his voice rough with emotion. But it got to the point where I didn't trust myself anymore. I thought Max would be better off without me. The room was silent, filled only with the sound of Ethan's uneven breathing. Then, another veteran spoke up. But he's here. He's still with you. That says something, doesn't it? Ethan glanced down at Max, who looked up at him with unwavering trust. Yeah, he murmured. It does. As the weeks passed, Ethan began to improve. He participated more in therapy sessions, forming connections with other veterans who shared his struggles. He started working with a trainer at the center to strengthen his bond with Max, relearning the commands they'd used during their service. Jacob visited often, offering quiet encouragement and helping Ethan navigate the ups and downs of his recovery. One evening, as the sun set over the fields surrounding the center, Ethan and Jacob sat on a bench near the edge of the property. Max lay at their feet, his tail wagging lazily as a breeze ruffled his fur. "I didn't think I'd ever feel normal again," Ethan said, breaking the silence. Jacob glanced at him. "You don't have to be the guy you were before. You just have to keep moving forward." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Thanks, Jacob, for not giving up on me, and for bringing Max back." Jacob smiled faintly. "He never gave up on you, Ethan. Neither did I." By the end of his time at Maple Haven, Ethan was a different man. He still had difficult days, but now he had the tools and support to face them. Max was his constant companion, a living reminder of the bond they'd forged and the strength they'd found in each other. Before leaving the center, Ethan met with Rachel one last time. "You've come a long way, Ethan," she said, handing him a small journal. "Keep writing. It helps to get the thoughts out of your head and onto paper." Ethan took the journal, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'll do that. Thanks, Rachel." As Ethan, Jacob, and Max climbed into the truck to head back to Evergreen Pines, the autumn trees lining the road seemed brighter, their colors more vivid. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a new beginning, one filled with hope, healing, and the unwavering bond between a man and his dog. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves as autumn returned to Evergreen Pines. Ethan stood on the small stage set up in a community center, his voice steady as he spoke to a room full of veterans. Rows of faces, each marked by their own battles, listened intently. "I thought I was alone," Ethan said, gripping the podium lightly. "I thought no one could understand what I was going through. But I was wrong. Asking for help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is reach out and let someone pull you back from the edge." Max sat obediently at Ethan's side, his coat glossy and his tail wagging gently whenever the crowd's applause rippled through the room. Ethan's hand dropped to scratch behind Max's ears, a gesture so natural it felt like second nature. "Max saved my life," Ethan continued. "Not just in combat, but afterward, when I was lost. And so did people like Jacob Carter, friends who refused to give up on me, even when I'd given up on myself." The audience erupted in applause as Ethan stepped back, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, Ethan sat at a small table in the corner of the room, signing journals and speaking with veterans who approached him. Many shared their own struggles, some with service dogs at their sides. Ethan listened, offering words of encouragement, while Max leaned against his leg, a steady presence. At the back of the room, Jacob stood watching, his arms crossed and a proud smile on his face. When Ethan finally caught his eye, Jacob raised a hand in a casual wave. After the event ended, the two men and Max stepped outside into the brisk night air. Stars scattered across the sky like shards of light, and the forest stretched out in peaceful silence around them. "You did good in there," Jacob said, patting Ethan on the shoulder. Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It feels good to talk about it, to let people know they're not alone." Jacob leaned against his truck, arms folded. "You're making a difference, Ethan. And not just for them. You've come a long way." Ethan looked down at Max, who wagged his tail as if in agreement. "I couldn't have done it without you, or him." Jacob smirked. "Max did most of the work." Ethan chuckled, the sound lighter than it had been in years. Over the next year, Ethan's life transformed in ways he never thought possible. He continued speaking at events, sharing his story of survival, loss, and redemption. His words resonated deeply with other veterans, many of whom reached out to him for support. Ethan also began volunteering at Maple Haven, helping new arrivals navigate their own journeys to healing. Jacob, meanwhile, returned to his work as a ranger in Evergreen Pines. The forest was his home, and protecting it gave him purpose. But now, his weeks included regular visits to Maple Haven, where he volunteered to assist veterans with outdoor programs and trail hikes designed to reconnect them with nature. One sunny afternoon, Ethan and Jacob met at the edge of Forest Ridge for a hike. Max bounded ahead, his energy a constant source of joy. "So," Jacob said, stepping over a fallen branch, "you ever think about moving closer to town? So you don't have to drive all the way to Maple Haven every week. Ethan shook his head, laughing softly. The cabin's home. Besides, it's nice being close to the tower. I like going up there sometimes, just to think. Jacob raised an eyebrow. The same tower you didn't want me to climb that night? Ethan smirked. Yeah, well, things change. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the forest surrounding them. Birds flitted through the trees, and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot filled the spaces between their words. As they reached a clearing, Max darted ahead, chasing a squirrel that vanished up a tree. Ethan watched him with a smile, his hand resting on the small journal tucked in his jacket pocket, the one Dr. Rachel had given him. He still wrote in it every day, pouring his thoughts onto its pages like a lifeline. I'm proud of you, Ethan, Jacob said suddenly, breaking the quiet. You didn't just come back. You found a way to move forward. That takes guts. Ethan looked at him, his expression thoughtful. I couldn't have done it alone. You and Max, you brought me back when I didn't think it was possible. Jacob shrugged, but his smile betrayed his pride. That's what friends are for. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the forest in shades of gold, the two men and their faithful dog headed back toward the trailhead. Max trotted ahead, occasionally looking back to make sure they were following. Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The shadows of his past were still there, but they no longer consumed him. He had found purpose in helping others, in sharing his story, and in reconnecting with the people and places that mattered most. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. And for Ethan, Jacob, and Max, it was a new chapter worth embracing.